This section deals with the United States at the end of the Civil War, right at the tail end of the American Civil War, and the effect that this tremendous war had on the process of trying to put the country back together, and what this process meant for American society. This period is generally referred to as Reconstruction, although this term, as you'll see, doesn't really reflect the complex reality of what actually took place in the United States. Reconstruction also has profound repercussions that we're still dealing with all the way down to this very day. The first thing that we should consider when talking about Reconstruction, is the nature of the American Civil War itself. Ask yourself, what is Civil War? I mean, your most basic and obvious definition is a war between the citizens of the same country. Unfortunately, this definition may not even apply depending on your unique philosophical perspective. Certainly some combatants on the Confederate side did not see themselves as citizens of the United States, and rather they felt they were members of a new country that was completely set apart from the United States. The fact that there is this intellectual and emotional understanding is part of what makes the American Civil War so unimaginably horrible in the first place. Put yourself in Confederate President Jefferson Davis's shoes. How many different ways might he be able to end the war? He could have a negotiated peace, outright military victory. There's any number of different outcomes that he can achieve that will actually bring the war to a close with the Confederates to answer their desires. Now think about the same problem from the U.S. President's perspective, Abraham Lincoln's perspective. Can he really accept any outcome other than total victory? And much of Lincoln's assessment of the Southern position is that they could not declare themselves independent and self-governing. The Southern states were simply in rebellion and not exercising the rights of a free and independent people. If Lincoln had negotiated with Jefferson Davis, that would have legitimated the Confederate position that they were in fact sovereign and therefore had every right to exit the Union. Ask yourself, can you negotiate as the head of a state with someone who is not also a legitimate head of state? So an example, think of it like this. The United States Congress cannot negotiate an economic or military treaty with the mayor of Paris, right? There's a certain level that you have to be negotiating these kinds of state-to-state contracts. Congress has to treat with the French president or the French parliament. And this idea of legitimacy forces the United States into the position of having to physically compel the southern states to end their fight, and this is through the harshest means possible. President Lincoln entrusts this job to generals, men like Ulysses S. Grant and the more ferocious William Tecumseh Sherman. And these generals just grind the military, industrial, and agricultural capacity of the South into dust. To negotiate a peace with Jefferson Davis would have provided absolute proof of the disunity of the United States, the legitimacy of the Confederacy. You know, there's nothing civil about war, and this is especially true of the kind of highly industrialized warfare unleashed upon the southern states in the 1860s. And to this very day, there are deeply held emotional and philosophical ideas about the destruction generated by this war. You can look no further than the public outcry over the appropriateness of displaying certain flags and certain war monuments. Within the last week, the city of New Orleans has decided they're going to take down monuments to Confederate war dead. So this is still, we're talking about things that have been happening in the last several years. And the passions that are inflamed by the violence and the destruction created during the American Civil War, these passions make the idea of Reconstruction, of joining the country back together, that much more difficult and that much more fascinating to study. There are problems even with so much as locating the actual end of the Civil War, American Civil War, in time. So historians have argued that the Confederacy was effectively finished after the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. And strategically or tactically there might be some truth to that, but this claim probably doesn't hold much comfort for the men that fell in tremendously horrific battles like Wilderness or Cold Harbor later in 1864. General Robert E. Lee did surrender what was left, just the ragged leftovers, the Army of Northern Virginia, to General Grant on the 9th of April, 1865. But does this really mean that the war is over? Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston surrendered the Army of Tennessee to Sherman on the 26th of April, 1865. And this is after he fought a retreat all the way across North Carolina. Which surrender is more important in terms of assigning a specific date for the defeat of the Confederacy? Do you even need to consider the military defeat when you're trying to locate the end of the Civil War in time? You can look at the Confederate government for a measure of when the defeat actually took place. So the government of the Confederacy dissolved itself on the 5th of May, 1865. Jefferson Davis was captured by U.S. forces on the 10th of May, 1865, near what is today the modern, it's more of a hamlet than a village, really, of Irwinville, Georgia. So as a historian, how would you demonstrate that the war has actually ended? And the only firm claim that you can actually make about the end of the American Civil War is that the shooting war stopped in late spring of 1865. Elements of the United States Army occupy the South until 1877, and this is 12 full years after the shooting has stopped. So despite modern claims to the contrary, that the destruction and occupation achieved this goal in the South, this idea of legitimate sovereignty plays such a powerful role in the minds of Southerners. It affects how they perceive themselves as a society and how they express themselves later, politically, socially, economically, how they interact with each other. And this vision of how they see themselves, this question of legitimacy, the need to destroy the South, to defeat it, plays a great role in the fight over how Reconstruction should actually take place and what social, cultural, and economic components need to be included in the program. So something a little out of the ordinary happened after all these Southern armies began to surrender in 1865. Historically, civil wars have ended in a aggressively vindictive amount of violence. And this is always directed at the defeated party, and it's partly to blame on the fact that civil war tends to engage passions at a level that are unmatched with just warfare that would be over economics or something like that. You're dealing with issues of personal pride, and you've got people from the same society fighting each other. It tends to be only civil war tends to only be topped in the scale of violence by religiously motivated warfare, where one side believes that God himself is telling them to kill the other side or defeat the other side, etc., etc. So typically, the defeat of one side leads to the purging of whole political parties. You get the destruction of whole ethnic groups, communities, cities. But this doesn't really happen at the end of the American Civil War. The victorious U.S. Army did not round up and execute every Confederate soldier, former Confederate soldier, they could lay their hands on. There was no widespread, indiscriminate retribution like you would have seen, say, following the end of the English Civil War, where people are executed and dangled from the nearest oak tree as a measure of, enforcing political rule. Now, the United States viewed Jefferson Davis as one of the principal villains of this war, as he was president of the Confederacy. And Davis, yes, he was sent to Virginia in chains after the war, but he was not executed. He wasn't hanged or mutilated in public like you would have seen happen to a similar figure in Europe. Davis himself only spent 2 years in prison, and President Johnson, after Lincoln was assassinated, actually pardoned him for all crimes and treason in 1868. Now, a very good example of this lack of retribution is captured in the record of General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain at the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. His account is commonly known as The Passing of the Armies, and his memoir records that the surrendering Confederates were treated with a tremendous deal of respect. And this is soldier to soldier. So the U.S. presented themselves in front of the surrendering Confederates in formation, to give them a certain amount of respect. And this, soldier to soldier, and especially at this time, was greatly appreciated by the Confederates. They were allowed to stack their arms and retire the flags of their units, and this is very significant behavior, especially when you consider these men have been engaged in a ferocious war. For years they've been slaughtering tens of thousands of each other, and when these Confederates are surrendering, they're not beaten, their flags are not stomped into the ground, they're not robbed, none of them are executed, and the status of the flags is especially interesting because flags are traditionally taken as a sacred symbol to a soldier, and the fact that they weren't stomped into the mud or burned, it shows this goodwill that was going towards these soldiers, shown by Chamberlain's troops. Now, unfortunately, you've even got these men that have been killing each other for all this time. This goodwill, for lack of a better word, is just not easily translated to society as a program for putting the United States back together in the wake of the war. Aside from the emotional and psychological issues faced by the nation, the American South faced major problems in terms of very, very basic needs. Parts of the South were totally obliterated. Major cities, your infrastructure is completely destroyed, and you consider this photograph here of factories and homes basically just reduced to brick rubble. Agriculture and industry is disrupted due to the combat. Casualties and death have soared throughout the course of the war. There's manpower shortages for industry and agricultural. So what if you had won the war? Great, wonderful, now what? If you were going to start to implement Reconstruction, putting the country back together, of bringing a conquered American South back into the Union, where would you start? What are the biggest priorities? Is the rebuilding of infrastructure, buildings, bridges, railways, are these the top priorities? Is dealing with the socio-political fallout from the end of slavery the most important thing? Simply because the South has suffered a military defeat and is occupied by the United States Army, that does not mean that Southerners are somehow suddenly given 21st century sensibilities and perspectives on race and society. So this job of fighting, winning, losing the war is completely dwarfed by the problem, the physical reality of putting the Union back together. All right, so consider this political cartoon. The cartoon is titled "The Rail Splitter at Work, Repairing the Union." And this is a great cartoon. It uses satire to poke fun at how just absurdly difficult it is going to be for the United States to confront all these issues of putting the Union back together. And President Lincoln is shown using a lever to hold the United States together while Vice President Johnson stitches. And political cartoons like this are an excellent source of commentary from the time period on how people are feeling, how they're looking at a situation. A lot of times through satire is really the only way that people can safely confront some issues, but political cartoons are a great historical resource. Another one of the realities for the United States in the wake of the war is that the United States government suddenly finds itself responsible for huge masses of free blacks. And one of the earliest ways of trying to deal with this situation is the formation of what's called the Freedmen's Bureau, under the direction of Jennifer Oliver Otis Howard. Howard, you can see in the photograph there, he's lost one of his arms at the Battle of Gettysburg. He's a military figure, and he's put in charge of running this bureau. And the Bureau operates in primary schools, and to a smaller extent they try and help people find land for their own use, but they're really dealing with mostly immediate problems. Basic need, physical problem, physical reality of food, shelter, that kind of thing. So the Freedmen's Bureau is not there to address the greater philosophical problems of the end of slavery. It's more to keep people from outright starving to death, but to begin to put those little building blocks together so that people can begin to live fruitful lives. The Freedmen's Bureau should not be considered one of the types of Reconstruction, but it is a very early attempt to move in that direction. And there were many competing visions for what form Reconstruction should actually take. And immediately the most two prevalent were called Radical Reconstruction, and then there was a longer term solution developed by President Lincoln himself. Radical Reconstruction was very punitive in design, and the loudest and most aggressive figure behind this type of Reconstruction was a man named Thaddeus Stevens. He's a member of the House of Representatives from Pennsylvania. He's a staunch Republican, and his radical vision for Radical Reconstruction has got three central features. Number one, the massive redistribution of land, total disenfranchisement of white voters in the South, and three, the institution of full civil rights. And this plan, just considering the parts of it, you can see it's designed to make a clear and extremely aggressive moral and emotional statement about the South, the station of free blacks, and how United States society should be operating. And many people are frightened by this stance of the radical Republicans and this radical idea of radical Reconstruction because it's so aggressive. Since the dawn of the United States, citizens have been notoriously sensitive to rights and status associated with property ownership. So to think about taking that away or redistributing it, it makes people unsettled. All right? To give someone the franchise means to allow them to vote. This is another one of those long-standing features of the United States that is ingrained in the national story. So when you talk about disenfranchising white voters for former Confederate sympathies or former military service, it's an extreme departure from the democratic tradition. And there's plenty of people in the North that do not agree outright with the extension of full civil rights to freed blacks. Now, despite the fact that slavery is over, that does not mean that citizens in the United States perceived society and people's racial identity in the way we would today. Even people that supported the extension of civil rights to freed blacks in 1865, radical Republicans, they would seem wildly racist in speech and action by the standards of modern 21st century America. Lincoln began to think about the mechanics of Reconstruction in 1863, and this is well before the end of the shooting war. His plan was much more moderate, much slower. There are four key features that distinguish Lincoln's plan from radical Reconstruction. Number one, he wanted a general amnesty for low-level people that served the Confederacy, and this included soldiers. Two, the upper-level white politicians of the former Confederate government would need to swear allegiance to the United States and the United States government. Three, Southern whites must swear to support the policy of abolition. And once this policy of abolition was supported by 10% of the population, and they accept items number 1 and number 3, then they would be allowed to create a new state government. 4, the franchise would be extended to blacks, but it would have qualifications. Mainly, A, they must own property, B, they must be educated, or C, they must have served in the U.S. military during the war. So that sounds strange given how we like to think about Lincoln. So remember that you cannot view the thoughts and actions of historical figures through the perspective of your own modern society. And we have really fond, mythologized visions of Abraham Lincoln. We think of him as this incorruptible paragon of racial justice for his part in just stomping out the institution of slavery in the United States. And part of that is true, but our legend is not entirely compatible with the historical evidence. By putting limits and qualifications on the access to a basic civil right, like voting, Lincoln would open himself up to criminal prosecution in a court of law today. And as a historian, you have to attempt to understand the past in its context, not in relationship to your ideas, your modern sensibilities, or your modern ideas. It's always acceptable to think about how past events have influenced and changed society, but you can never read the present backwards onto things that happened in the past. Congress reacted to the president's plan by coming up with yet another platform for Reconstruction. This one is called the Wade-Davis Bill, after Henry Davis and Benjamin Wade. Now, there are four key features to the Wade-Davis Bill. Number one, the United States government itself would impose governors on the conquered states. Two, when a majority of citizens swear allegiance to the United States, an occupied state would be allowed to form a delegation and therefore create a new state constitution. The delegates must not have fought for the Confederacy, and the new state constitution must include language that explicitly abolished slavery. Three, all politicians and military leaders of the Confederacy would be disenfranchised. And four, the South must give up on any and all attempts to collect claims for damages caused by combat or combat actions during the war. The Wade-Davis Bill was more severe than Lincoln's plan, but not nearly so severe as Reconstruction proposed by men like Thaddeus Stevens or the other radical Republicans. The Wade-Davis Bill did give the United States a great deal of power in the political structure of these states because they would be allowed to appoint the governors. Now, keep in mind, there's no language about the extension of the franchise or redistribution of land in the Wade-Davis Bill. Now, there's a sudden change in the controversy over Reconstruction on the 14th of April, 1865, and that is because President Lincoln is assassinated. While he's attending a comedy at Ford's Theater in Washington, Lincoln is shot from behind by a former actor and enraged Confederate sympathizer by the name of John Wilkes Booth. This photograph shows Ford's Theater. And this image was created sometime after, shortly after, I would think, the assassination, because you can still see that the building is draped in Victorian-era black garland, which is a sign of the cult of mourning. It's what they call the cult of mourning. The Victorians took mourning to a whole new level. No one does funerals and grief quite like the Victorians did. But also, if you look on the lower left where the arrow indicates, you can see military guards standing outside the building in dress uniforms, and they're wearing their white gloves. This is a photo of the pistol used by Booth to kill Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not killed outright by the bullet, but he died they carried him across the street to Peter's house, which is almost directly across the street from Ford's Theater. And aside from a general desire to take revenge on Lincoln, Booth calculated that the death of President Lincoln might produce a groundswell of support in the South and undo the surrender and the collapse of the Confederacy. Now, this belief demonstrates a total disconnection with the reality of the social and military situation in the South. Revenge and hate are historically very, very powerful motivators driving human behavior to do all manner of extreme things. Remember what I've already said about the passions that are brought up by civil war just in general. Booth is hunted down and shot by the U.S. Army on the 26th of April, 1865. Eventually, 8 conspirators are captured and tried, and of the 8, 4 are hanged, including one woman. You can see there she is on the end, indicated by the red arrow in the photograph. This assassination was a traumatic episode, and consider it just kind of dropped on top of a society that is already trying to sort out a war that has cost more than 600,000 lives. A war that was enough to make people question the fundamental nature of liberty and the fundamental structure of the Union itself. And I would argue that the cruelest irony of the entire war is the assassination of Lincoln itself. And despite all the unreal bloodshed that the United States had suffered and endured during this war, the most pointless waste of a shot was the one that actually killed Lincoln. And clearly there is a miscalculation on Booth's part concerning the reaction of Southerners. But the greater tragedy is the staggering scale of Booth's mistake in terms of the reaction of folks in the North. So there was a tremendous outpouring of grief at the death of President Lincoln. A special train was used to carry the president's body from city to city as it made its way back to Springfield, Illinois for burial. The photograph on the right is of this train. Well, it's the engine for the train, called the Nashville. And of course, again, you see the train is decked out in the finest of Victorian mourning decorations. There's a huge portrait of the president hanging on the front of the engine. And hundreds of thousands of people come out to see the train as it rolls along from city to city to city. And even though they're in the midst of this mourning and they're still unsettled from the end of the war and all of the death that generated, people are really, truly pissed off. So Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, was also a poet, captured the national sentiment in a poem that he wrote at the time, where he said, "There is sobbing of the strong and a pall on the land, but the people in their weeping bear the iron hand." And there's a little bit of prophecy there, because the death of Lincoln did absolutely nothing to help moderate the conditions of the coming program of Reconstruction. Vice President Johnson is sworn in as president after the assassination, and he makes a kind of a last-ditch effort to reconcile all these different ideas about Reconstruction. And his plan is known as Presidential Reconstruction. And the 5 general features of Presidential Reconstruction are: 1, there would be a widespread amnesty for the former Confederates. 2, the President and not Congress would appoint governors to the occupied southern states, and this appointed governor would be responsible for putting together a delegation to generate new state constitutions. 3, they must formally revoke their declarations of secession. 4, they must abolish slavery and ratify the 13th Amendment. And 5, they must give up on trying to collect these war debts. Johnson's plan is significant because it puts great power in the hand of the president in terms of selecting governors. And already here you can see conflict building between the executive and legislative branches of government over who is going to have the most control and how it will be exercised in these occupied southern states. And again, notice a distinct lack of talk about enfranchising free blacks and how these concerns take a back seat to everything else. In December, Congress rejects Johnson's plan, and owing to a large degree to sentiment generated by the death of Lincoln, goes ahead with a much more punitive form of Reconstruction. Under the Reconstruction plan approved by Congress, the South is divided into 5 military districts, and Congress appoints military commanders to oversee the districts. The districts were required to register all men to vote, black and white, as long as they had not fought for the Confederacy. Each new state constitution was required to contain specific language stating that black men can vote. Only after meeting all these conditions would a state be allowed to choose its own government. And even then, Congress would have to sign off on all new state constitutions. And as a final measure, before readmittance to the Union, each state had to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments. The version of Reconstruction that was ultimately implemented, that you see here in this map, gave very, very little power to the states and left them under direct military occupation. And many Southerners resented this oversight and viewed this form of Reconstruction as unnecessarily punitive and condescending. And so immediately, Southern states moved to restrict freedoms and behaviors of formerly enslaved blacks. They institute a series of very strict rules and laws that become known as the Black Codes. And these codes were designed to preserve traditional structures in society while skirting the rules that were being placed upon the occupied states by the North. So an example is they had loose rules about vagrancy and requiring that someone have a job. So a black man just walking down the side of the road somewhere could be stopped and questioned, and if he was not on his way to or from work, or couldn't prove that he was on his way to or from work, he was labeled a vagrant and was therefore locked up. Now once he was locked up, the state could then lease him out for hard labor. So you can see how these laws are specifically designed to perpetuate a lot of the same things we've seen in the American South, while giving it this veneer of credibility. Of most concern for the United States government were the restrictions the Black Codes placed on voting. And specifically, this slide talks to the idea of the literacy test, which is you would have to pass certain tests testing your intellect to be allowed to vote. And the literacy tests are absurd because first, there's incredibly low literacy rates throughout the South, especially among poor whites, and that's the irony of this political cartoon. The satire here is that the very fancy, well-dressed planter, Mr. Solid South, can barely write himself, and so he's being lampooned in this idea of having these qualifications to vote. Now, the point is very clear, but I also want you to take a second and look at everything else that's going on in this image. So consider what this image, which is defending the idea that free blacks in the South should have access to voting, but look at the portrayal of the black man at the corner of the building. He's grinning, laughing, he's falling down laughing. So even in an anti-black code cartoon, there's this incredibly negative stereotype. And the result of the black codes is to generate major political conflict between the occupied southern states and the political structures in the North. The United States government's response to the black codes and their effort to wrangle these attempts by the occupied southern states to circumvent civil rights legislation is the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Basically, these are very fundamental civil rights legislations. The first really major civil rights legislation in the United States since the Bill of Rights. And they're a direct response to the black codes. The 14th Amendment grants citizenships to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and it specifically includes former slaves. The 15th Amendment gives black men the right to vote, right of citizens to vote, and that right cannot be denied based upon someone's prior condition of servitude or their color. So these are attempts to categorically nail down the right to vote in the South. And there's a little bit of give and take back and forth between issues of the black codes and the federal government all the way up into 1877. The South remains occupied until 1877, but the problem is that it becomes too valuable as a source of potential votes in presidential elections or major federal elections. So what happens is you see the federal government start to backtrack on its stance. And I can give you no better example than a speech given by President Rutherford B. Hayes to a group of black voters in Atlanta in 1877, where he said, "Your rights and interests would be safer if this great mass of intelligent white men were left alone by general government." So there's really no better example of Reconstruction being over. The president goes from a figure basically punishing the South to telling black voters to step aside and let whites run the government for their own benefit. This idea of the federal troops pulling out in 1877 and government's role in organizing the South changing creates an atmosphere where many of the kind of worst examples of racially motivated laws come back into play in the South. And these ideas are eventually enshrined in law. And specifically, I'm thinking of 1896 with the court case Plessy versus Ferguson. And what Plessy versus Ferguson does is it makes segregation legal. And this is what you've seen. I'm sure you've seen it 100 times before in documentaries and everything. Separate facilities, as long as they are separate, that's completely legal as long as the facilities are equal. Now, of course, this never worked out in practice, but it still becomes enshrined in law. And separate but equal, segregation is a policy that does not change for 58 years. We're talking 1954 before it really gets challenged. And it's not until 1964 and 1965 that the United States government revisits basic civil rights laws. So we're talking 68 years before the United States permanently does away with this kind of nonsense. And what you get in the South between 1877, the withdrawal of United States federal troops, and the 1960s is an era called the Jim Crow era, where law and social norms are reinforced by all manner of legally and artificially constructed boundaries, legislation. So race-based laws and social institutions are maintained all throughout the South through violence and the power of the state. And we will talk more about Jim Crow moving on, but this is where the groundwork for Jim Crow really gets laid, is right here.